Hello, all. Welcome to Phenomenal Science Teaching. Let's go ahead and get started with today. First thing I want to do is introduce myself. I'm your presenter. My name is Vic Sampson. I am an associate professor of STEM education at the University of Texas at Austin, where I teach graduate courses in learning theory, instructional design, assessment, research in the STEM disciplines, and then I also teach undergraduates, both elementary and secondary, for pre-service teacher education, right? So I do the methods classes for that as well. So glad you're joining us today. I'm really excited to be able to putting on this series at the beginning of the year to kind of start thinking about teaching in different ways. Some of the things that we'll be covering in this session is kind of the big changes that are happening here in Texas. Yes, let's go ahead and kick this off. So one thing I want to remind everybody about is if you're interested in continuing education unit credits, we're offering 0.5 credits per session. And if you attend all of the full series that we're doing, you can earn actually 6 credits, which is always good for you if you're needing, you're working here in the state of Texas and you need to renew your licensure. That is a great thing to get those credits here. So always important to make sure you're logging in and signing up for these webinars so we can get that information to you. Quick overview before we get started with today's webinar is the basic structure of here. So we're trying to keep these short and bite-sized, so they're not these very, very long, in-depth runs, but we're trying to kind of chop things up as we go and move through this. Basically, the idea is in the first, from about 4 to 4:20, we're going to be talking about the topic of the day. Then we'll open up for questions, 5, 6, 7 minutes. We can go as long as we need to, and then we'll do a quick wrap-up and announcements going forward from there. So that's the basic structure of all of these webinars, so you can kind of plan accordingly if you're going to attend more than one. Let's go ahead and get started. So what we wanted to do today is talk about the big changes in the new Science TEKS. So here in Texas, we adopted new TEKS a few years ago, and they go into effect this year. So one of the big things that's going to be needing for all of us as who's working in the classroom is thinking about what are those changes look like? What are we going to be doing? How's that going to influence what instruction looks like, what our curriculum needs to be addressing, and that kind of thing. So what we want to do today is just do kind of a big changes overview for those of us that haven't had a chance to dig into this yet. So what I want you to do is the Texas Education Association has laid out a kind of a side-by-side of the big changes between what was adopted in terms of 2017 for science standards versus what was adopted in 12 and goes into effect this next coming school year coming up. So what I'm going to do is in the chat here is I'm going to drop a link here, and if you'd like to go to that, if you click on that link, you can go there and you'll see what's on the left side of the slide here, and you can pick a grade, download the PDF, and it'll bring up a side-by-side. So like I took a screenshot there of grade 8. Feel free to grab that and take a look at that as we're going through this. It's a pretty nice reference about the big changes. So while you do that, I'm going to start kind of talking about what I'm seeing as big changes on there. So not surprising when you add new standards or revise standards or go through adoption process, there's going to be new content, right? So anybody that's been teaching at a grade band or a specific course, you're going to see different content coming up. When you look at the side-by-side, that makes it very clear of what's new, right? So the blue and the orange represent the changes, and you can see all the way through that there's a lot that has been changed. So everybody that has been teaching under the old TEKS, you're going to see a lot of new content that has not been in your course before that are going to be needing to be addressed. The second big change is the addition of something called science and engineering practice. So the old standards, we talked a lot about processes and skills. Now we're talking, we've changed that language, and we've talked about science and engineering practices. And these come from a book called A Framework for K-12 Science Education that was published in 2012. I'm going to drop that link here in the chat as well. You can take a look at this book at any time, absolutely free. It's a great download. You can get the PDF or you can read it online. But it goes into great detail of talking about what these practices are. And here's just a couple of quotes that stick in my mind about what that ends up looking like, right? So the first one is, science is not just a body of knowledge that reflects our current standing, right? So it's not just facts and terms and content. It's also a set of practices that are used to establish, extend, and refine that. And both of those elements, knowledge and practices, are essential and given equal weight. And the reason the practices are used instead of a term such as skills is because engaging in scientific investigation requires not only the kind of skills and process that we've been focused on, but knowledge that's specific to each content. Let me show you what we mean by that. So one of the practices in the new TEKS is use tools to observe, measure, test, and compare. That seems pretty similar to what we had in process standards as before, process TEKS. But now it takes that one step farther. So in the past, we could kind of treat this TEK as a skill to master, right? So we could give kids practice problems like this and say, okay, what is the volume of the liquid in these graduated cylinders, right? And focus on just the skill of reading a measurement, right? Using that kind of tool. Now, what we're doing now with the new standards when we're thinking of this in terms of practices is thinking this about the knowledge that goes into deciding what you need to do to use tools and measurements. So the practice becomes not just measure something, right, using a graduated cylinder, but thinking about, okay, I see these things. For example, these samples of metal here in the image. And it's thinking about things like which observations or measurements will be most useful. How many observations or measurements do I need? What's the best tool to use for making these observations or measurements? How can I be sure my measurements are accurate? When we have kids start asking questions and being able to think about these and answer this, it becomes a practice and not a skill. And it's very, very much tied to content, right? So you can ask these same kinds of questions, but it varies on what you're studying and what you're investigating. So for example, if you're looking to, come across a metal and you need to know what that metal is as part of an investigation, you can ask yourself all these questions. But the same questions apply to if you're studying stars, right? And if I'm looking out and I want to study star, what observations are going to be measurements? What observations or measurements will be useful? How many observations or measurements do I need, right, to be able to answer the questions I have? So we can go through these exact same kind of questions, but they're very content specific, right? So depending on what we're studying, how we're going about studying it, and what questions we're trying to answer reflects how we engage in that practice of using tools to collect and gather information. Right. So that's how we're moving. That's one of the biggest changes is we're moving from practices to or away from skills and processes to more of these practices of understanding why we're doing what we're doing and how we can reduce error and that sort of thing. One of the reasons that those practices are included in the new TEKS is to better specify what is meant by inquiry, right? So long has been kids need to engage in investigations, but there's a wide range of cognitive, social, and physical activities that any kind of investigation or inquiry requires. And this kind of helps make sense of that in terms of the thinking processes that go into planning and carrying out an investigation. And one of the other things it's really important to keep in mind is that students have to engage in these practices and not merely learn about them secondhand. So it doesn't really help kids to be told what a practice is or use this practice or thinking about that practice. Students cannot fully comprehend those without actually directly experiencing those. So getting in and trying to answer questions about what measurements I need, how do I reduce error, is this enough? Those are the kinds of questions they have to do over many, many times to actually develop some expertise in these different kinds of practices. The next, one of the other things you can see, if you want to look at how these practices build, TEA also has produced another document, and let me drop this into the chat as well. Let me grab this link. So on this one, what you want to do here is if you click on this link that I'm putting in the chat, they actually have some documents that talk about how these practices play out in each grade, right? So they think of this as, okay, what are we doing in first grade, second grade, third grade? Where's the overlap? Where's the things drop off? Where they're added to? Here in Texas, I would argue they're not as coherent and building upon as other sets of standards, but they're making steps forward in terms of there's going to be a repeated focus on practice all the way through. So it's not enough just to say that they did this thing once, but really thinking about context and knowledge of various content area and core ideas really influence what you do with these practices, right? Helping kids understand how that changes, whether you're studying astronomy or physical science or some kind of phenomenon related to those. The next big change you can start thinking about, before we go on that, is another thing you can think about is when you start looking at that list of practices, it gets to be long, right? So they'll say that there's this one and this one. There's actually 2 full sets of TEKS with A, B, C's, and D's related to that. What I have found really useful when it comes to thinking about TEKS is thinking about how you can use them for various functions when it comes to these practices. So I put them into kind of 4 categories. Other people do in different ones, but I found these useful. So I kind of think of these as investigative practice. So these are the things that you need to do to be able to collect data about something that you're studying, right? So these are like asking questions, planning, conducting investigation, using tools, gathering data, right? So those all kind of are lumped together when you're investigating something. Then there's also sense-making practices. So these are the practices that you use when you're analyzing and making sense of what you've uncovered, right? Developing explanation, using models, using mathematics, developing explanations, right? So it's taking the kind of the concrete and developing those answers and making sense of something based on data. And then there's finally the communicative practice is where we spend time sharing what we've learned, listening to others, engaging in discussion. And at the heart of all 3, which go into all of this, is the critiquing practice of science, right? So how well do ideas, or how well are they supported by evidence? Was the right method or the right type of investigation used? How can we trust the data that we have? Is that a good explanation that actually answers these questions, right? So the heart of all of these is kind of critiquing. So I like to think about these 4 bins that these practices go into, and I found that's useful for helping kind of teaching kids about these different kinds of things when you're engaging them in investigation of what kinds of things to be focusing on and how you can kind of group these together. The next biggest change is the addition of recurring themes and concepts. So this is completely new for the TEKS in Texas, is that we've added a whole nother category. So instead of just being concepts and processes, now we've got practices, recurring themes, and then the disciplinary content. And the recurring themes and concepts that are found in the new TEKS are these. There's patterns, cause and effect relationships, models and systems, energy and matter, structure and function, and stability and change. What these come from is, once again, the framework for K-12 science education. I'll drop that chapter link into the chat as well, so you can see that. You can read up on that if you want to. Right now, we're just kind of introducing these ideas, but you can think of these as the bridge disciplinary boundaries, right? So whatever discipline you're studying, you're going to see these all the way through, right? So you're going to see this focus on patterns or energy or cause and effect. And what they're useful about is they provide us students with an organizational framework or a lens that they can start looking at the world from, right? Let me kind of show you what I mean by that, because that doesn't always make sense, right? So if we look at this video here, we'll take a look at this fountain here. So what we end up seeing is water coming out of this straw, right? That was once inside kind of the bottle, and you've got this balloon on top. So the questions that you end up saying is, like, you can ask yourself, does the flow of water stay stable, or does it change over time, and why? Is there patterns that I see? What causes the water to come out of the straw? How can I measure the quantity of water that comes out of the straw, and which scale should I use? Can I create a model of the system and help to understand what's going on? How can I track the movement of matter into, within, or out of the system? right? How's the structure of the fountain affect its functions, right? So these are all different lenses that you can do, and all equally valid to investigate this with. But it becomes kind of your framework. Am I taking this from a stability and change kind of framework, or am I looking at this in terms of structure and function? And these allow you to kind of think about what kind of information that you need to collect when you're engaging in these different practices. The last big change is an expectation for instruction to be three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional or one-dimensional. Now, this has been a kind of a hot topic through science education for the last 10 years or so, but the idea is that we're looking at using the three dimensions of science that I just talked about at the same time instead of doing them one at a time or maybe in pairs. And let me show you what that means today. So this is a graphic that I use to help kind of make sense of how this is working, right? So if you think about these three big bins of standards that kids need to think about. There's the science and engineering practices, and that's what scientists and engineers do to figure out why something happened or develop a solution. Then there's the disciplinary content. That's all the models, theories, and laws that scientists and engineers use as a starting point, right? That's like kind of our foundation of what we're moving toward or starting from to figure out something new. And that's often been a big focus of instruction, of knowing the content. And then there's the recurring themes and concepts, and that's how scientists and engineers decide what to pay attention to. So any one of those isolated is a kind of a one dimension. If you overlap and focus on two at the same time, so maybe like practices and content, right, that's two-dimensional. And when you focus on all three, you get practices, content, and a framework at the same time. Now, what that ends up looking like for what's happening in school is, if you sort of think about what students are doing, if they're only focusing on content, one-dimensional, they're learning concepts and terms. If they're only focusing on practices, they tend to learn kind of skills without content, which really doesn't make them much of a practice, but that's often like in isolation at the beginning of the year. They have to learn this before they tie that to content. If you do those both at the same time, they're learning about content by engaging in a practice, and so on and so forth. And when you get to the middle, that's really where we become three-dimensional. That's where students use content, a framework, and multiple practices to figure out some kind of phenomenon. And what we're going to do with the rest of these webinars is really focus on the phenomenon part of this, of using what do we mean by these recurring themes? What do we mean by these practices? How do you give kids more opportunities to figure out phenomenon in the world that's around them? So I'm going to wrap up for today on that as just kind of a big overview of the new TEKS, of where we're sitting and where we're going with that. If you have any questions about what we talked about here today, you can post your questions in a chat. So what we'll do is we'll wrap up for today. Our next Thursday, we'll be talking about recurring themes and concepts. So today, all I would really did is tell you examples of what these are, kind of giving a big overview. What we're going to do is spend the entire webinar talking about what these mean, right? So when we're talking about cause and effect, what do we mean by patterns, right? So it's a good refresher for all of those. Oh, great question popping up. What do you anticipate will be the biggest challenge to implementing the SAPs and recurring themes and concepts? So what I think is going to be the biggest challenge is in doing them all at the same time, right? What we have spent traditionally in Texas a lot of time is kind of doing lab work or investigation work separate than the content. Or we use kind of like the instructional process as a precursor to learning the content, right? I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is that shift to three-dimensional, of really thinking about how do we do this at the same time? Because I think a lot of the closest that we've gotten is kind of inquiry learning, where we're thinking about engaging in a practice to learn a concept. But really with the three-dimensional aspects of this, it's more of using a concept, using a theme, and using a practice to explain something else, and then learning more about each of those as part of the engagement and using those. So I think I agree. Right now, labs are about 40% of instructional time. I think there is going to be more and more of a push to more time of investigation, right? So what we're really going to need to start thinking about is what kind of materials are going to allow us to make this change. because this stuff looks very different, like I mentioned, of what we have done in the past. And I would argue using existing investigation, existing labs, things like that is not really going to cover that, even if they're inquiry based, because they're not really three-dimensional, right? So you end up having these isolated pieces and you never get to that three-dimensional piece of what the new TEKS are calling for. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge on those. Plus just learning what these are and what they look like. As educators, many of us have never experienced learning about science this way or teaching that way. So it's going to take us some time to kind of figure out how to best support kids learning with that. As we go through these webinars, keep joining up. We're going to keep talking about these issues. Like next time, we'll talk about recurring themes and concepts. You can get a handle on that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the practices in more detail. We'll talk about phenomenon. Then we'll really dive into more into 3D instruction. We'll talk about 3D assessment. What's the best way to introduce a phenomenon to create a need to learn, right? It's not really just an example of a concept. It's really something that's puzzling that kids need to figure out. And then how do you foster learning after you introduce a phenomenon? Because that doesn't cover everything of just saying, hey, here's a phenomenon to figure out. There's going to be a lot more talk going on in classrooms in this kind of instruction. So how do we promote and support that so it's productive? We'll spend a couple parts on that. And then supporting emerging multilingual learners in science as well. So yes, there's lots of things to be thinking about, and we're going to spend this whole quarter on that. Another question will be longer trainings offered this summer. Absolutely. What we do is at ADI, we offer trainings on an approach that you can use, argument-driven inquiry, to do three-dimensional instruction. What I'm doing here with these webinars is kind of giving an idea of just kind of a bigger overview that we can get bite-sized. But if there's definitely interest, we can put in more different kinds of workshops and things like that where we can do this not kind of one way through a webinar, but actually interacting on things. So feel free to contact, actually I'll put that up here. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can contact us on socials or just send me an email at victor@argument-driven-inquiry. I can answer any of your questions for you about any of this stuff. And if we want to talk about different kinds of professional learning experiences, we can do that. So if there's not any more questions on that, I'm going to wrap up the webinar for today. As always, we will post this on our website so you can send anybody else to it. We will also send you a copy. If you registered for the webinar and you can't make one of these, we will also send you a copy of the video so you have that. I'm going to actually put that link in there for you to be able to register for that so it's a little bit easier before you go. Hold on, there we go. So make sure you sign up for these. It takes only a second, and then we can make sure we got videos being sent to you. Feel free to share them with anyone you want to. Send anyone to our website to watch these to just kind of get an overview. I think of this as just a starting point to really start digging into kind of the big changes of going on with new standards. So we're here to help. Once again, my email is victor@argument-driven-inquiry. I'll put that in the chat for you. You can contact me with any questions, or if you want to talk about anything, I can also point you towards some useful resources, whether that's reading stuff like I threw in the chat here today, or simpler articles, or if you just want to have a chat about these things, I'm here to help in any way possible. So hopefully I'll get a chance to see most of you all next week again. And like I said, we're going to be talking about recurring themes. What are those? They're more than just concepts. So all of those kinds of things, right? So Joanne, that's a great question. How do we know what tools we'll need for 3D learning? Send me an email real quick and I'll talk you through that, because that is going to be a little bit of a longer question to talk about that on that kind of stuff. So thank you so much, everybody. It was great to see you. Hopefully see you next week again. Thanks all.